Have you ever wondered what truly hides behind a woman's desire? Not the gentle, poetic version you read in novels, but the silent, chaotic hunger that hides behind her eyes, the one even she pretends not to understand. Sigmund Freud once called desire the royal road to the unconscious, but what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that this road led somewhere darker than any dream. A place where morality fades and instinct becomes the only language. In Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, Freud began observing his female patients, women who came to him trembling, restless, suffering from symptoms that no doctor could explain. They spoke of loneliness, hysteria, emotional collapse. But underneath those polite confessions was something else, something he felt but could never name. He called it repression, a force that buried desire deep beneath layers of shame and duty. Yet the more he studied them, the more he realized it wasn't repression alone. It was resistance against an inner truth too dangerous to admit. Freud began noticing patterns. Behind every broken word, every tear, every trembling silence, there was longing, but not for comfort or security. It was a craving for surrender, to something stronger, more forbidden. A pull toward the darkness that both frightened and fascinated them. He wrote once, privately, "A woman's desire is not gentle. It is a storm disguised as grace." He never published that note, because to admit that would destroy everything. Society had built an entire illusion around the idea of feminine innocence, that women desired affection, not power, protection, not dominance. But what Freud found in the depth of the unconscious was the opposite. Desire was not weakness, it was power itself, and this truth terrified the men who ruled the world. He would sit across from a patient, a woman trembling, confessing her dreams, and he would listen. Dreams of strangers, of shadows, of forbidden touch. When she spoke, he saw her eyes light up with shame and excitement all at once. It wasn't the man she wanted. It was the feeling of being wanted, the intoxication of being seen in her rawest form, without masks, without civility. Freud realized that feminine desire wasn't about the object. It was about the mirror. The man was merely a reflection through which her buried chaos could safely emerge. Desire, for her, was a way to remember her wildness, to escape the prison of being a good woman. But when Freud tried to explain this, that women were not passive beings, but carriers of immense, untamed energy, he was ridiculed. His peers called it madness. His mentors warned him, "Do not publish this. You'll destroy your reputation." And for a while, he obeyed, because even Freud feared what he saw. He had unlocked something that men were not ready to hear, that women's desire could be darker, more primal, and more dominant than their own. It wasn't submission they sought. It was the freedom to surrender voluntarily on their own terms. And that subtle difference made all the difference. Late at night, in his notes, he began to call it eros beyond morality. He saw desire not as a sin, but as a sacred rebellion, the unconscious revolt of nature against the chains of culture. To desire, he wrote, is to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. But then came the silence. The church hated him. The medical establishment called him corrupt. Even his students grew distant. They wanted Freud the scientist, not Freud the heretic. And so he buried his most controversial observations deep within coded letters and private journals. He spoke vaguely about dreams, about Oedipus, about repression, but he never again dared to fully describe what he had witnessed in those sessions, because what he discovered wasn't a theory, it was a mirror, and when men looked into it, they saw their own fear, that women were not innocent creatures waiting to be desired. They were desire itself. One afternoon, after a particularly strange session with a young woman, Freud wrote something that would never see print. He said, "In every woman's dream there lies a god and a beast, and she loves both because they remind her she is alive. That line was crossed out with ink, but later found in his drafts. It was too revealing, too honest, because that was the truth he had been forced to keep silent. That desire in its purest form, female desire, is not moral or rational. It is chaotic, transformative, and ancient. It seeks not comfort, but awakening, not safety, but meaning. It pulls men into her world not to destroy them, but to make them face what they fear most, their own vulnerability. And that's what frightened Freud more than anything. Not the women, but the mirror they held up to every man. He realized that understanding female desire meant understanding the part of ourselves we keep locked away, the wild, irrational part that society calls shameful. He had uncovered a truth that civilization was built to deny. So he closed his notebook, and the world continued believing that men desire and women respond. But Freud knew better. He knew that beneath every smile, every silence, every polite word, the real story of desire was still being written, not in theories, but in the hidden corners of the mind. And it whispered even in the quiet, what if the one thing women hide is that they were never innocent at all? Freud's discovery did not end with theory. It began with an experiment, one that he would never speak of publicly and one that would haunt him until his final days. It started with a woman named Anna O., one of Freud's earliest patients. She was not insane, but she was restless, plagued by dreams, paralysis, and sudden waves of emotion she could not explain. Doctors called it hysteria. Freud called it the voice of something buried. He listened to her speak, hour after hour, about her fantasies, her fears, her hunger for something she didn't understand, and as she spoke, something strange began to happen. Her body trembled, her breath quickened, and in her words, Freud heard not illness, but longing. She desired something beyond pleasure, a release from the polite mask of the world, a liberation from the expectation of being good. Freud called this the talking cure, but deep inside, he knew it was something far more dangerous, a ritual of exposure, where desire escaped the cage of repression and showed its true face. As Anna's sessions continued, Freud noticed a pattern. When she spoke about desire, her symptoms lessened. When she tried to suppress it, they returned. It was as if her body was keeping score, punishing her for denying her truth. That realization changed everything. Freud began to wonder if all repression was the root of human suffering, if every polite mask we wear is merely a slow form of decay. But this idea, that unspoken desire fuels illness, was too radical for his time. To even suggest it meant to question the morality of society itself. And so Freud began experimenting, quietly. He studied the dreams of women, their slips of the tongue, their confessions written in trembling hands. He wanted to see what happened when repression was lifted, when desire was allowed to speak without shame. One night, Freud wrote in his diary, "Desire is the most intelligent force in the human soul. It knows what the mind denies." He started to view hysteria not as madness, but as the body's rebellion against silence, and this frightened him, because if it were true, then the entire structure of civilization was built upon suppression, not order. Then came the moment that changed him forever. One of his female patients, we'll call her Elise, began to express deep attraction toward him during their sessions. Freud, the scientist, told himself it was a transference, a projection of the unconscious onto the analyst. But the energy in the room was undeniable. When she spoke, her tone changed. When he looked at her, the air felt charged, like electricity moving beneath words. He realized that he had crossed an invisible boundary, not physically, but psychologically. He had entered the forbidden space of desire itself. To observe it meant to awaken it, and to awaken it meant to risk losing control. Freud would later write, "He who studies desire must first be devoured by it." And he was. Elise began describing dreams where she surrendered to shadowy figures, half divine, half monstrous. She said they made her feel alive, terrified, and free all at once. Freud listened, writing notes feverishly until he began to see the same dreams in his own sleep. The boundaries between doctor and patient began to dissolve. He was not the observer anymore. He was the participant. That was when he stopped the sessions. Abruptly, he told Elise she was cured, though he knew she wasn't. In truth, it was he who feared what might come next. Because Freud understood something chilling. Desire was contagious. It spread through words, through silence, through the smallest glance. And once awakened, it refused to go back into the dark. After that experience, Freud began to rewrite his theories. He shifted from the language of love to the language of instinct. He called it the id, the part of us that never learned morality, that speaks only in hunger. And though he gave it a scientific name, he knew what it really was. It was the beast in the heart of every human being, male and female alike. But in women, he saw it more clearly, because society forced them to pretend it wasn't there, and what is repressed grows stronger. Freud once wrote privately to a friend, "The more a woman denies her desire, the more it defines her." Those words were never published. They were too dangerous, because they implied that the control men thought they had over women's emotions was an illusion. The real control, the deeper power, belonged to the one who could awaken desire in another, then withdraw it. This was the secret Freud tried to bury, that the unconscious feminine is not passive, but sovereign, that beneath her gentleness lies a current of desire that does not submit, it chooses. It decides who may see it and who never will. Freud feared that if this truth became public, the world would unravel. Marriage, religion, morality, all the illusions of control would collapse, because desire is not moral. It does not obey. It does not ask for permission. And that, perhaps, was his greatest fear. That beneath every civilized conversation, beneath every polite marriage and every sacred vow, there still lived a primal current that refused to die. A current that whispered in the silence between men and women, "You cannot control what was never yours to begin with." When Freud died, his daughter Anna burned several boxes of his private letters, at his own request. No one knows exactly what they contained, but one letter survived, hidden in an archive. It ended with just one line: "The secret of female desire is not what women want, but what they are willing to surrender for what they crave." And with that, the experiment was erased. But the question remains, what if Freud wasn't suppressing madness, but protecting us from a truth too powerful to live with? Freud's experiment left him shaken, but not defeated. He had seen what happens when a hidden force of the mind is denied, how it bends logic, shatters order, and quietly reshapes human behavior. He began to call this force eros, the drive that moves every living thing toward creation, attachment, and meaning. What disturbed him wasn't desire itself, but its defiance. Civilization needed rules, yet Eros refused to obey them. The more culture tried to silence instinct, the louder the instinct spoke through dreams, art, and conflict. Freud realized that repression was never perfect. It always leaked through the cracks. He watched society grow polite on the surface and restless underneath. Wars, obsessions, addictions, each was a symptom of the same inner tension, human beings trying to live without acknowledging what they really want. He began to see repression not as moral strength, but as psychological pressure building inside a closed vessel. So long as Eros remained chained, the mind would find darker ways to express it. Freud's critics mocked him for turning everything into psychology, but he wasn't searching for scandal. He was warning humanity. He wrote, "If civilization demands too much repression, it will pay with neurosis." And he was right. He saw that when passion is buried, it does not die. It transforms into control, envy, and cruelty. The same energy that could create love or beauty could, when denied, destroy both. To Freud, the unconscious was not evil. It was simply honest. It said what society wouldn't. And deep within that honesty, he saw the origin of both tenderness and aggression, the twin faces of Eros. His students wanted clear theories. Freud gave them parables. He told them, "The mind is like a city built upon ruins. You walk its streets unaware of the ancient foundations beneath your feet. Every polite gesture, every moral code rested upon forgotten passions, ancient fears, and unfulfilled longings. To know the self, one had to dig through layers of denial, and that frightened even the brave." As the years passed, Freud's work took on a darker shade. He began writing about Thanatos, the death drive, the pull towards stillness and destruction that mirrors Eros. He saw the two as eternal partners, creation and collapse, love and loss. The same energy that binds people together can also drive them to ruin. In that duality lay the secret he believes society could never handle, that the human soul is not divided between good and evil, but between order and chaos, and both are necessary. He taught that to repress chaos entirely is to become numb, mechanical, unfeeling. But to surrender to it completely is to become lost. Wisdom lives in the balance, the awareness of our shadow without letting it rule. That was the heart of Freud's message, stripped of scandal and secrecy. The unconscious isn't a prison to escape, but a landscape to understand. When his students asked how to live with such knowledge, Freud gave a quiet answer. "We make peace with our monsters by allowing them to speak." He didn't mean indulgence, he meant acknowledgement. To face desire, any desire, honestly, without shame or glorification, was the path to maturity. But society wasn't ready for that. It preferred illusion over insight, and so the rebellion of Eros continued in silence, in literature, in music, in the restless yearning that fuels every generation. Even today, the world still struggles with the same tension Freud saw a century ago between the masks we wear and the forces we hide. He once wrote to a friend, "One day, people will thank us not for curing them, but for teaching them how to see themselves without running away." That, perhaps, was his truest legacy. When Freud's health began to fail, he left Vienna carrying more than suitcases. He carried questions that the world still hasn't answered. He had mapped the unseen forces that move through every human life, yet he knew the map was incomplete. What he feared most was not ignorance, but denial. Even in exile, Freud kept writing. He no longer spoke of scandal or secrecy. He spoke of truth, the quiet kind that doesn't flatter the ego. He wrote that the unconscious is a faithful historian. It remembers every wish, every conflict we pretend to forget. And if we refuse to listen, it finds other ways to speak, through dreams, habits, even accidents that reveal what words conceal. Freud saw civilization as a fragile negotiation. On one side, order, rules, families, institutions. On the other, instinct, the pulse that drives art, love, risk, creation. If one side wins completely, humanity loses balance. That is why he called psychology a work of reconciliation, not control. Many of his followers softened his message. They turned Eros into romance, repression into politeness. But Freud's darker insight remains. The idea that every person hides a storm beneath the smile. It is not evil, it is energy waiting for form. To channel it consciously is wisdom. To deny it blindly is tragedy. He once compared the mind to an iceberg. Only 1/7 is visible. The rest drifts below the surface, shaping the currents of life while pretending to be still. That unseen mass, he said, is where destiny begins. Our choices, our attractions, even our fears are guided by that hidden gravity. Freud's silence about his most controversial findings was not cowardice, it was caution. He believed some truths must ripen before they can be spoken safely. He knew that revelation without readiness becomes chaos. So he left clues instead of confessions, letters, metaphors, fragments of unfinished thought. They invite us not to worship him, but to continue the search he began. Today, neuroscience, therapy, and art still circle the same mystery. Why do we want what we want? Why do we fear the very things that make us feel alive? Freud's answer would be simple and unsettling. Because the unconscious is not a stranger, it is the oldest part of ourselves, speaking a language we've forgotten. He urged his students to listen without judgment, to observe the mind as one observes a dream, symbolic, contradictory, sincere. Only by seeing our hidden motives can we choose freely. Otherwise, freedom is just another illusion. As he neared the end of his life, Freud wrote one final line in his notebook. The mind will always whisper its truth. The question is whether we are brave enough to hear it. That sentence is the real inheritance he left behind. Not scandal, not theory, courage. The courage to look inward when the world demands distraction. The courage to accept that the same force that builds civilizations can also break hearts, create art, and ignite change. And so the dark secret that Freud kept silent was never truly about women, or desire, or even repression. It was about human nature itself, the reminder that beneath every rule, every faith, every polite word, there is a pulse that cannot be erased. It is the pulse of Eros, the will to live, to connect, to become. Freud's silence invites us to listen to that pulse, not to fear it, not to worship it, but to understand it. Because in understanding it, we finally see ourselves, not as sinners or saints, but as whole. And that perhaps is the one secret no generation should ever keep silent again.